And thank you very much, all of you, for showing up on this gray, gloomy day. Lots of light here. No. But I know how tough it is actually to go to seminars at the end of the day, at the end of a working day. And I'm very grateful for you showing up. Okay, so this is a joint piece with a group of friends, colleagues of mine who are based at Statistics Norway. One of them, Jürgen, has just moved to Oslo Met, but is still associated with Statistics Norway, with Rolf over there and Ola Vestad. Okay, so this is part of is the first piece we are doing on issues related to business income and how improving the measurement of business income can lead us to potentially different estimates of income inequality. So that's exactly what we are going to be doing. We're going to be looking at a new measure. I'll tell you exactly what it is, a new measure of business income, and then we want to assess how this affects our understanding of income inequality. And you can imagine it's going to be in Norway. So we do this performing a pretty straightforward, pretty simple analysis, but using pretty cool data too. We use administrative tax records combined with lots of other data. We have ownership data of all firms in Norway and firm level balance sheets data as well, so that we're going to be able to allocate corporate profits to personal owners, to individuals across the whole economy from 2001 to 2016. Okay, so for those of you who probably have to leave, maybe almost immediately after this slide, or are going to get lost, or bored, I'll give you the punchlines essentially. So with this new measure, which I'll illustrate to you, we'll find the standard inequality estimates of income distribution increase dramatically. And just to give you an example, the shares of market income that go to the top 1% of the Norwegian population increase from, say, 10% using official measures, the official measure here being the official measure of business income, to something like 15–16% at the very least. So they go up by more than 50%. Maybe this is not going to be entirely surprising, given that we are talking about business income, which possibly affects indeed the very top, these guys. But it also affects another very widely used measure of inequality, Gini coefficient, which actually goes up from 0.25 on average, using the standard measure of business income, to 0.33, a whopping increase of 30% roughly. Was there a question? No. Okay, so why do we do that? Maybe in an environment like this, I should not really try to motivate it too much, but for those of you who want to have a little bit of a bite, let's say, okay, let me not motivate it from a measurement viewpoint, let me motivate it from an economic viewpoint. So economists in the last 20 years or so have all of a sudden become aware of the fact that, well, it's not really fair. But economists have always been extremely careful with measurement issues, and some more than others. But in these last 20 years, there has been really a big interest among economists of trying to use the best possible measures of income in order to understand how the evolution of income inequality is going. And one of the things that we have really emphasized is the importance of top incomes at the very top of the income distribution. And in order to do this, most of the evidence that we have come up with is using administrative tax records. And Tony Atkinson and colleagues, among whom Rolf Åberge, one of my co-authors, and Thomas Piketty, and the big group of these co-authors scattered around the world, are among those who have really pushed a lot this agenda and made seminal contributions here. Administrative tax records are very nice, have lots of advantages. However, they also have some limitations. And we are coming to know more and more about them as we start learning more and more of the evidence that through administrative tax records we can count. One of the key challenges is that is indeed related to the measure of business income, the source of income we are interested in this paper, according to which the administrative tax records will be incomplete. And this is going to be problematic if indeed we think, as we know also, that business income is going to be a major source of income at the very top. And in order to do this, let me just illustrate this idea with a very simple picture. In the picture that I'll show you in a sec, I'm going to have the measure of the official measure of business income, the one that Statistics Norway uses to publish all their reports. And here we're just going to be looking at the top decile of the income distribution, and we're going to be looking at the composition of income across 4 different major sources of income: labor income, business income, other capital income, and government cash transfers. Okay, these are the 4 components. And as you can see, this is the top 10% of the income distribution, the top decile. And as you can see, labor income has the lion's share of the distribution of income, even among these top guys. Okay, but this is essentially true up to the 98th percentile. Okay, so up to that point, labor income makes up 80% of total income that people have. At that point, the business income part is actually relatively small. It goes from 2% almost up to probably 10%, maybe a little bit below 10% of total income that people have at the individual level. However, if you look at the last 2 percentiles, the picture changes quite dramatically. And we are seeing, in fact, a huge increase of the fraction of the share of income that is attributable to business income. This goes up from 10% to essentially 60% at the very top, while labor income, the labor income share goes down quite a lot from 80% to 25%, roughly. So as you can see, we clearly have to be very concerned about what's going to be going on at the very top. Otherwise, we may miss out a big part of what the rest of the distribution is going to be affected by. Okay? So that's where we are going. Okay, so now I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what you're going to be inflicted through my presentation. I start by illustrating the problem of measurement of business income in general. Then I'll propose our new measure, then we go through the results that we are interested in, and I then conclude very briefly. Okay, so the measurement issue. Let's start from a very, very simple decomposition of or identity of the definition of income through the 4 sources that we've seen before. I put actually here P, business income, in bold, precisely because that's what we're going to be doing. That's where we are concentrated on, and this is where our innovation is going to happen. Okay? Now, in official statistics in Norway, the measure of business income is simply going to be given by the sum of dividends and taxable realized capital gains. Okay, so this clearly will have some drawbacks because this measure of B only refers to realized income. And realized income has problems. One is the fact that it includes capital gains that are not necessarily confined to the current year, but they might refer to asset appreciations that have happened long before, maybe decades before. It's just that the firms decided not to distribute them at that point. And in fact, this is the second issue, which from an economics viewpoint makes the problem very interesting. And it's not just a question of measurement, but it's a question of strategies that firms have. Firms might actually respond, say, to the tax environment, and if they are sensitive to the tax environment, they may decide to realize dividends or not. And if they don't, then this is not going to be part of, then this is going to be part of the of one definition of business income rather than another. And that's actually very important. And then, of course, another major drawback is the fact that this realized income accounts for indirect ownership, but only partially. It's not that it doesn't account, but it accounts it partially. And I'll show you actually how important that can be. Was there a question? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question on government transfers.
Yeah.
Does this include income from Norway's huge sovereign wealth fund to pensioners and other people
Yes.
like that?
Yes, yes.
Anything else?
Anything that is included in the official statistics in Norway, it's actually going to be part of this, our definition.
Right.
These guys are the guys, the three co-authors of mine, are the guys who are in charge of coming up with the statistics that Statistics Norway publishes every year. So Rolf Haberge is the guy who's been working with Tony Atkinson for the last 25 years before Tony's death. But and Rolf has been very much at the forefront of revolutionizing these measures, but he has never been able to. So let's hope that with this type of work we are able to push not just Statistics Norway, but the government to take this type of things. So yes, everything that is done officially by Statistics Norway through L, K, and T is in here. And then the only thing that we do, we modify their definition of B. Yeah?
Very much, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the, here I mentioned the fact that realization decisions are a choice of the firm, are likely to be a choice of the firm. And just to give you an idea, we're now going to be seeing a very simple example. We are in the process of doing a more formal exercise here, where we are concentrating on two tax reforms that happened in Norway in 2006 and in 2016. Maybe something that is going to be also relevant given to us, given the electoral time we are going through. And you would immediately spot what I mean by this. 2006, the first of a major tax reform, which increased tax on dividends to personal owners from 0% to 28%. Okay, we're in Norway, eh? but you see what sort of stuff we are talking about. While corporate dividends remained untaxed, so 0% on corporate dividends at that point. The reform was introduced in 2006. It was announced in 2004, and therefore that gave enough margin to firms potentially to modify their behavior in the fiscal year 2005. And that's what we are going to be seeing here. The bold part of the DD analysis stands for difference in difference analysis. This is the more formal part that we are in the process of doing. So we are thinking of having a control group of firms, and the firms that are at the very top, or a control group of personal owners at the very top of the distribution, as opposed to those that are at other parts of the distribution, and then see what happens before and after the introduction of the reform for these guys. 2016 reform seems to have had many, a more modest remit, increasing the tax dividend from 28% to 31.68% over a 4-year period. So a staggered increase over a 4-year period. This is the last year of this increase, where the 31.68% rate is the one in place. But despite the fact that in 2016, it went only up by 3/4 of a percentage point. We see in the picture that I'll show you in a sec, next slide, that it had a big impact. And here it is, in fact. This is the amount of dividends that we are seeing across the whole economy, given up in millions of Norwegian crowns, and two personal shareholders. And as you can see, in 2005, sure enough, in anticipation of the reform that would have come in 2006, remember, going from 0 to 28% in terms of taxes for these personal dividends, for the dividends to personal shareholders, you see that there is this huge spike, and you see a pretty similar spike also in the case of the 2016, in anticipation of the 2016 reform. The other interesting thing that I wanted to emphasize with the dashed line running underneath the solid black line is the fact that the dividends going to the top 1% are in fact the lion's share of all the dividends that are going on in the economy. Okay, so the guys who are really the top 1% are the guys who are receiving most of the dividends that we are seeing distributed every year. Okay, so now we're proposing our new measure. The goal is to have a measure that will be able to capture both realized and unrealized business income. One approach, which Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman have proposed, it's a paper that was published last year in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, is a combination of tax records and national accounts. And then with a number of pretty bold, strong assumptions, they are able to arrive at an imputed measure of business income. Okay, so we believe we can do better than that. We don't need these many strong assumptions, which I'm not going to go through, and we can go through individual accounts rather than national accounts. And so we built on a piece of work that other people at Statistics Norway have been doing, apart from Alstadseter, Jacob, and Telled. There is Kovchuk, who's at Columbia University in New York. And these guys and we are essentially proposing to go for a different strategy. What is the strategy? We're going to be using ownership data. So we need to have lots of data, very well-defined, specific data. We have ownership data for the whole firms, for the whole universe of firms in Norway, and we have firm-level balance sheets. So we are going to be able to allocate corporate profits to personal owners. And the concept of income that we're going to be using is a concept based on retained earnings. Okay? So the retained earnings component you will see will allow us to essentially get rid of the problem of double counting when we have to deal with massive indirectly held, with a massive number of indirectly held firms. Okay? So essentially, in a nutshell, for those of you who are not going to be interested anymore in extra details, that's all, right? But now we are going to have a few slides for those of you who are interested in. So for the first group, maybe you can switch off for a few seconds. For the other group, maybe this is the time when you wanna come in. But the idea is essentially we want to construct this more comprehensive measure of personal income, which have both these components, realized and unrealized. And this will allow us to have a business income measure that measures it when income accrues rather than when it is realized. And therefore is going to be much less sensitive to tax changes, to changes in the institutional environment that affect taxes, although, but we believe correctly so, it will be much more sensitive to business cycle, right? Depending on how the economy goes, because this is going to be a big chunk of how the economy goes, we are going to have fluctuations potentially in this business income. And you will see that that's actually going to be the case. Okay, so this objective of constructing this measure of business income as it accrues and avoiding double counting can actually be done probably relatively easily for pass-through entities, essentially for small for partnerships, and typically relatively small, but not very small in general, but in general, yeah, and sole proprietorships. The reason is because these guys are reporting their incomes in their personal tax returns, and therefore it's going to be easy through the administrative tax returns to be able to capture their net income. Problem is that these guys, pass-through entities, are only a small chunk of the whole economy. The largest group of players that we're interested in are limited liability firms. And for them, there is a problem. So the idea that we have essentially is to use all this data that we have in order to mimic the pass-through regime for these firms. Here's just to give you an idea of the different legal types of firms that we have in Norway. I chose 2015, but these numbers are pretty much similar across all the sample years. And as you can see, private limited liability firms account for 90% of the turnover, sales plus income, and for more than 3/4 of employees. And instead, sole proprietorships and partnerships account for many of the firms. Many of them are tiny, 50% roughly altogether, but account only for less than 4% of turnover and less than 12% of employment. So we clearly, if we want to have a bite on the economy, we clearly have to bring these guys on board. And these are the problematic people that we have got to deal with. Okay, so now to illustrate the problem that we have when we want to measure this income as it accrues rather than when it is realized, we're going to face a problem with indirect ownership. And the indirect ownership brings us immediately to the issue of double counting. To illustrate this, I'll give you a very simple example. Suppose that we have one owner, I, who owns shares in firm J, SIJ, and shares in firm K, SIK. Now, suppose also that the firm J, of which individual I owns a share, also has a share of another of the other firm K. Okay, and that share is SJK. Now, the firm J then will earn profits pi j, which are given by the sum of its own economic activity, pi tilde, but also the dividends that come from firm K. Okay? And so Sj, remember, Sjk is the fraction that firm J owns of firm K. Tau is instead the fraction of profits that firm K distributes as dividends pays out as dividends to firm J. Okay? Now, for simplicity, otherwise I get really confused on J, K, and other subscript, etc. I keep a very simple assumption that K doesn't own any other firm, and therefore the net profits, after tax profits that firm K has, will be equal to the own economic activity produced by firm K. Okay, so now what happens? If we sum up the after-tax profits without the tildes, we get this pi j and pi k, but these are going to be bigger than the economic activity that we should be measuring in the economy. And why? Because we are essentially counting an extra bit, which are the dividends that go from firm K to firm J. Now we can see the same issue when we are going to be building up our measure of business income, which is summing up all of these different components. And as you can see, essentially, we're going to be double counting the profits of or part of the profits of firm K in the form of the dividends that go from firm K to firm J, as long as this tau proportion is actually positive. So as soon as there is a firm that pays dividends to another, not necessarily to an individual, to another firm, then we are going to run into problems of double counting when we are constructing this measure of business income. So one issue would be, one possibility to deal with this problem is essentially to ignore it. Let's say, okay, forget about it. Now, it is a possibility, and some people would like to do that. Problem is that we are going to be underestimating income at the very top. And in fact, I'm not going to go through, but at the very end of these slides, I believe in fact it is slide 47, we are going to have a picture where we see our measure of the share of income that goes to the top 1%, when we only have direct ownership, and when we have both direct ownership and indirect ownership. And the differences between these two series are substantial. And especially after the 2005 anticipation of the reform in 2006. And the reason is because indeed indirect ownership has become much more prominent. One of the ways in which people at the very top are sheltering against taxes is actually through indirect ownership. Okay? So
why is it so? Because you don't need to declare it?
Exactly. I mean, you do, but the thing is that you're not going to be paying them. You're going to be a corporate owner. You're not going to be an individual owner. Yeah? So then here comes the stuff that Rolf has been working for so many years and never been able to convince people to adopt. The idea is actually to use a very simple identity. The identity so we are using the concept of retained earnings. So profits could actually be seen by definition, by an accounting identity. Gosh, I always skewed away from accounting, but in this case, I have to use it. So the accounting identity being that profits are going to be equal to the sum of dividends and the change in retained earnings. Once we make once we use this identity, is going to be extremely simple. Most of the issues, all of the issues that we were concerned about, essentially fall out. I can already tell you, essentially you're going to be multiplying this guy by the share of ownership that each people have in the economy, and this across all the different firms that each individual owner will have, and then that's it. But let me take you through, potentially also through the math of this stuff. But so if we aggregate, therefore, all the changes in accumulated retained earnings across the whole economy, across all firms, this will lead us to aggregating across all profits for all firms in the economy, net of the dividends that are going to be paid to shareholders. And therefore, this indeed leads immediately to our idea of using as a measure of personal owner shares of the firm's profits, precisely personal owner shares in the change of accumulated retained earnings plus the dividends, the total sum of all dividends at the personal level. And so in other words, we have this change in retained earnings and dividends for firm J, which individual I owns, and for firm K that the individual I owns, and we multiply it by the shares that the individual I has on each one of these two firms. Plus what? Plus the indirect ownership share that the individual I has of firm J through, of firm K through J, times the change in retained earnings, because the direct the dividends are not relevant at the indirect ownership level. Okay, simply because these guys are going to be personal, are going to be corporate, and not, and therefore zero tax, and not individual level. Once you substitute out all these different things, you know what exactly delta R and plus D are through the whole little expression, mathematical expression, you end up exactly with what we want. We want to be able to capture the economic activity, the ones that is indicated by the tildes, for the whole economy. And we're able to do this precisely using this retained earning definition. Once we have that, in fact, all these dividend terms cancel out, and we are back to what we wanted. We have this measure of business income that is given by the owner's shares of total net income generated by the two firms in this case, in this example. So this is going to be, for those of you, and I'm sure that here at ONS, lots of people discuss about these issues or have come across this concept. With this measure of income, we're getting closer and closer to the idea, to this philosophical, almost philosophical idea of Haig-Simon's income definition, okay? Which is seen by many as the sort of gold standard for measuring annual income, including capital gains and accrual. And you know, Armour, Larrymore, and Berkhauser, for example, have been proposing these sort of discussions as well for the US and for a number of other countries, Australia, and I think also for the UK. Okay, so perhaps you're not going to be interested. I just give you a very quick snapshot of the difference between our measure and the measure that Alstad-Setter and colleagues have. That it's essentially, it's a relatively minor difference. In our case, we're going to be interested in proposed incomes, in proposed dividends. So the dividends that firm J at time t-1 proposes at the General Assembly, while instead they are looking at distributed dividends. Now, the difference might seem a little bit philosophical. I'll come to it in a sec. In fact, in most cases, the two are equal to each other. However, it's not always the case. The difference between the two, when it happens, are extraordinary dividends. And the presence of extraordinary dividends could actually be crucial in some particular years. And it turns out it is pretty big in 2005, in anticipation, again, of that famous tax reform. So I'm not going to show you. Essentially, our two measures pretty much go hand in hand for most of the sample period we have. But in 2005, they have a peak in terms of the inequality measures. We don't. And then they have a bit more of a peak in 2016. 2015, in anticipation again of the 2016 reform, while our measure doesn't. Yes?
It was just one for clarification. So I'm kind of looking at it through like a national accounts framework. So if I take like the household's financial position,
yeah,
things that kind of feed into like the saving ratio or the extent to which households are lenders or borrowers. So I've got my, I guess my labour income concept, which is like wages, salaries, and social contributions.
Yep.
And then what I throw in other stuff, which is, I don't know, things like dividend incomes and kind of transfers, which you spoke about. So that's a traditional measure of B. So in terms of the difference between, I guess, a national accounts concept of B and this one, is you're broadening out to indirect firm ownership. So this idea about, because I'm capturing the direct dividends I receive anyway, but you're saying there's an indirect essential income stream coming to
Yes.
households, which this is picking up.
Totally.
So, but in terms of the kind of limitations of the traditional measure, I accept that it is sensitive to tax policy change, and even in the UK, I think it was 2017, there was some change to dividend income taxation, so you can even see it in Q1 and Q2, there's a big spike. That would still be in this new measure of B, because you're still capturing the traditional measure. So you still got the sensitivity.
No, we are not capturing the traditional measure. We are proposing a completely new one. Of course, the two might be similar, even when there are not, or well, they might be different, even if there are no specific incentives not to be, getting dividends rather than not. You will see, in fact, not necessarily on the measure itself, but on its impact on income inequalities. They will be different. And of course, even more so when there are, in fact, greater incentives, either to shelter away from paying dividends or not. So we are trying really to measure what the economic activity is at the macroeconomy level, and embed that in our measure of B, essentially. Most of the traditional way of building up B is avoiding that, because they can't actually access retained earnings within firms. We instead observe them, and we see whether or not they decide to distribute them, post dividends.
Oh, so you're saying you can kind of look through those responses to incentives?
Oh, absolutely. We are getting at the individual firm level.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. I mean, we're not going through the personal, through the national accounts like Piketty and Saez and Suchman do. We are getting it at the micro level for each firm in the whole economy. And so we can see exactly what their balance sheets are and what their decisions are in year T-1 in order to and see whether or not they pan out in year T.
And we might cover this later, so I won't preempt it, but could you then take this alternative measure and then calculate things like an alternative saving ratio that would be higher because households are receiving more? I assume it's more, it might not be more.
No, we don't do it. We don't do it, but I think we could.
Because I accept, I think one of the criticisms of saving ratio is all around flow type concepts, so the capital gains ones are excluded, rightfully or wrongfully. Right. So I guess there's this idea of what do households actually see, and so there are transactions in national accounts no one would really respond to, but it's probably things that
I would expect. I think it's a very interesting point. I would expect to see very little happening for a big chunk of the distribution, but maybe at the very top, again, these sort of things will probably pan out. Let's see if you're going to be sort of enticed into this thing by going now to the results. Before going to the results, I just want to give you the same picture that we've seen before on the top B side, using the using the standard definition of B. And now the only thing that changes now is again only B. I'm going to show you the same stuff looking at our measure. Not expect anything dramatic, but it is pretty dramatic, I would say. This is it. So you see that what happens is that, yes, again, the big lion's share, the lion's share of the distribution of income up to the 98th percentile is still driven by labor income. But then look at what happens in the last two percentiles of the income distribution. Essentially, we are going to be giving an even bigger role played by business income at the very top. So while before, at the very, very top, 60% of income was attributable to business income, now it's 90%, perhaps even more. So this is a huge difference, okay? Okay, now the question is that going to be enough for us to change our understanding of the evolution of income inequality, which is ultimately one of the things that I believe this institution is very interested in. I am very interested in. Lots of economists are very interested in. Let's see if it makes any difference. So I'm told that I'm getting almost out of time. Okay, so we are going to be looking at shares, occurring at the very top, and we're going to be looking at Gini coefficients. And then for the Ginis, where we are using the appropriate measure of income, household disposable income, not income at the individual level, like we are doing for shares. And we're going to be also performing decompositions. And I'm going to be showing you something that has to do with our measure B, the statistical, the official statistics measure B, and in some cases I'm going to be showing also what happens when we have labor income alone, just to see how important this B may or may not be. Okay, so here we start with the shares echoing to the top 1%. And as you can see, this is what happened. Maybe you don't see it because of the line, but this guy is tracing the line very well. It's the shares of income that are attributable only to labor income, to the top 1%. This dashed line in the middle is the one that we get by using the standard official definition of B. But the one at the top is using our definition. So as you can see, say in Norway, these two measures were along this particular type of income inequality measure were sort of tracing each other pretty well up to 2005. But then from 2006 onwards, the two are going in slightly different directions. And one of the reasons is precisely because firms are behaving very differently from according to our definition. I mean, we are capturing a part of behavior of the firms that couldn't be captured by the standard definition. And this reveals us something very important, besides that, which I think is very important from economic perspectives. But from a policy perspective, one thing that we come up with is, look, you know, from 2006 onwards, the standard measure was telling us that the top 1% has 10% of total income, and a little bit more from 2015 onwards. But according to our measure, this is at least 50% more. So it's 15%, 16%. In 2007, the estimate was, you know, bizarrely very high, 24%. And so on average, we talk about a 50, 60% increase in the fraction of income that is owned by the top 1%. That's one. We are repeating the same thing, again, top 1%, but we're repeating the same thing for the top 10%, for the top 0.1%, and the top 0.01%. And you can see that for the very, very top, the differences are huge. Here, it's twice as much, on average. Right? From 2006 onwards, our measure will, you know, in some years, is 3 times as much. So the top 0.1% owns something like 4% according to the, or 3% according to the standard measure. According to our measure, is something in the order of 8%, 10%, 15%, top 0.1%. Okay, so we're talking about amazing inequality, and we're talking about a country that has got huge marginal tax rates, even on dividends, as opposed to our environment. Same thing emerges in the case of Ginis. Here we don't have just labor income, but the solid line here now is what we have with the standard definition of business income, while the dashed line is the one that we proposed. So this is the sort of Gini coefficient we will be able to have with our definition. And as you can see, this guy is actually much more, I mean, it's relatively similar to the shares to the top, to the shares going to the top 1%. The sort of time patterns are relatively similar. Not only that, but of course it fluctuates a bit with the business cycle, procyclically. So here a bit of an expansion for Norway at the beginning of 2005-6, and again another bit of an expansion in 2011, while in 2008 a bit of a recession. Well, it wasn't a recession, but a bit of a deceleration of growth. So as you can see, again, as I said, in one case, after 2005, the sort of mean Gini would be around 0.25. According to ours, is going to be at least 0.3, 0.33. So a 30% increase, as I was anticipating at the very beginning. So we have seen this. We are doing the compositions. Essentially, we do these decompositions because we want to understand how the inequality shares are evolving over time. I think that the time is getting tight, and therefore I probably go very quickly on that. We use this decomposition that lots of people have come up with. Where the important components are going to be income, the income shares of each component. We have 5 components. The 5th component here is the 4 components as we had before, plus the 5th component, which is taxes. And then we have so we have the product of the income shares for each component, and this gamma parameter here, which is the concentration coefficient, which is the conditional Gini coefficient, conditional on the rank order in total income. And so an interesting number to look at is the inequality shares, which are simply given by the product of the income, by the income share of each component, times the concentration coefficient divided by the Gini coefficient. Okay, I mean, maybe I should tell you. Essentially, this gamma coefficient, as well as the income shares, will decide how whether or not a particular component has got an equalizing contribution or a disequalizing contribution to income inequality. And if we get a positive gamma, we are going to have this disequalizing contribution. If we have this stuff that is negative, we are going to have an equalizing contribution. And here is essentially the results. So according to our measure, this is using our measure, we see that both business income and labor income have disequalizing contribution to inequality, but the two are relatively similar. I mean, there is a bit of a difference, but the two are relatively similar, and the differences are getting slightly smaller towards the end of the sample. If we compare this, our measure, to the official measure, you see that the official measure will attribute much more importance to labor income and much less importance to business income. Okay, I mean, the other thing that you probably would have noticed is that clearly taxes and transfers are equalizing, as we would have expected, although towards the end of the sample they become less so. Fine, and according to both pictures, the other capital income essentially plays very little role. And then when we look at either factor shares, the two components, or two of the components that are relevant for the inequality shares. When we look at factor shares and the concentration coefficients, factor shares we see that they're relatively stable across all different measures of all the different components of income. The only one that is a little bit oscillating, that is fluctuating a bit, is business income, but precisely because we know we wanted it to be reflecting more of the business cycle. And in fact, the concentration coefficient does that even more so. So, the two levels, beginning and end, are relatively similar, but the changes over time are reflecting more the changes in through the business cycle. Okay, so I don't think I want to bore you anymore about repeating the fact that we have this new measure based on retained earnings and proposed dividends. We end up measuring B as it accrues rather than N it is realized. And we are using these huge data sets for the whole economy in Norway. We have this different understanding of how inequality evolves over time, and even the interpretation through the decompositions is actually changing. In other words, we're assigning much more importance to business income than what we would have had otherwise, and this measure of business income is going to be less sensitive to tax changes, but more sensitive to the business cycle. Where next? Millions of potential directions where we can go. One, as I was anticipating, we want to complete this difference in difference analysis, precisely to validate our measure as opposed to the more traditional measure, to the official statistics measure. We want to investigate more the role played by corporate taxes, which right now are silent, and we want to understand whether or not we are going to have a different view on transitions at the very top using our measure as opposed to the traditional measure. That would be it. I think I'm done. Thank you very much.